October 5th, 2018, the Distinguished Lecture Series presented by the National Atomic Testing Museum, Killing the Wild Well of the Deepwater Horizon Disaster, the Pivotal Role of NNSA Labs, presented by Dr. Thomas O. Hunter.
Our speaker this evening, we're so lucky to have him. Dr. Thomas Hunter began his career at Sandia as a project engineer for advanced development at the Nevada test site. And then he moved on to become a project manager for Yucca Mountain, lead the California laboratory in Livermore, California, and then became Senior Vice President of Defense Programs. After that, he was appointed Laboratory Director in 2005, and he retired in 2010. In 2010, just when you thought you were retiring, right? He was asked by the Secretary of Energy, Dr. Steven Chu, to co-lead the government's scientific team to find a solution to the out-of-control well resulting from the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which is what he's going to talk about tonight. And in 2011, he was asked by the Secretary of Interior, Ken Salazar, to lead a newly formed Ocean Energy Safety Advisory Committee. And following that, was asked by the Department of Justice to be a lead witness on the civil trial related to the oil spill, and most recently, lead an advisory board for the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. He is also, we're so lucky to have him as a Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation board trustee. His educational background is extensive. He has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of Florida, a master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Mexico, and a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Wisconsin. And his PhD is doctoral work in nuclear engineering at the University of Wisconsin as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Hunter.
Thank you very much. Am I on here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. I'm going to lead you through an experience that we had in the laboratories about 8 years ago. I won't remember everything clearly, but I'll try to recall as much as I can. But I do want to make a couple of comments. First of all, this really is an example of the role of the national laboratories. Particularly the three NNSA laboratories are entirely unique in that they have a role. Many of you in this community think of them as associated with the Nevada test site, but the role goes far beyond that. And they're responsible for the nuclear deterrent, which has kept us out of strategic war for about 75 years or so. But also they do a wide variety of things. One thing they do is answer the phone. And I'll tell you the story about me answering the phone, which led to all this. But whenever there's something very serious going on that deals with science or technology, invariably these three laboratories get phone calls from places that you'll never hear about. But the bottom line is they are national treasures, and they represent broad scientific and engineering capabilities that get used in a variety of applications. This is just one. Second kind of message is about life planning. In 2010, I had decided to retire as laboratory director, so I had worked on the process of getting a successor, and that was all done. And I was actually in the process of announcing it all and letting people know that I was going to retire. And it was public at that time. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the engagement of the Congress on that topic. But I had no idea whatsoever to get involved in this. I got a phone call, and I'll describe that. But it turned out to consume about the next 6 or 7 years of what I did in retirement. And of course, I didn't have a very good retirement plan like maybe some of you, but this sure took its place. And so that sure changed things. The other kind of message is that there are a lot of stories about this. There's a book written, it's called The Hole at the Bottom of the Sea. I worked with the author somewhat, and it captures pretty much what happened. But there's a lot of inaccuracy about what happened and who did what and all those things. And pretty much the scientific literature has captured those inaccuracies and carried many of them forward. And I'll try to describe what some of those are as well. It's one of those events that kind of changed everything. I recall April 20th, 2010. This is back when the news actually had news, and it was only 8 years ago. But there was news on the news, and the news was that a drill rig in the Gulf of Mexico had caught on fire. Tragically, 11 people lost their lives, and this drilling ship caught on fire, burnt for a few days, and sank. That was bad. But what was really bad was there was oil spewing out from what's called the mud line, but the bottom of the Gulf. And this oil was going to contaminate the coasts of maybe not Texas, but certainly Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and potentially Florida. And everybody was worried about the contamination and what to do about it. And no one had any clear idea about how to stop it. So the way we got involved was reasonably straightforward. There was a undersecretary at the time of the Nuclear Security Agency in NSA, and his name was Tom D'Agostino, and he had asked the laboratories, each of the 3 laboratories, to contribute some ideas about how we might help. I was lab director at the time, and I wasn't in the office, which was typical. And so I didn't know what we sent in to Tom, and we sent in some ideas. I didn't ever see them all. One of the ideas was to use cutting charges. Those words, cutting charges, was in this list of ideas. And so on Friday night, it was April the 30th, 2010, I got a call at home. And the phone call said, I think they said they were from the National Security Council or somewhere. I don't remember exactly who called. But they said, we understand your people have some ideas about how to use cutting charges to help with this problem. And I thought for a minute, I said, well, I don't think cutting charges sound like a great idea at this point, but I'll look into it. So I hung up the phone. I quickly called Lawrence Livermore in Los Alamos and Sandia, and I got about 3 or 4 or 5 people from each lab on the telephone that night, Friday night. And we mainly were thinking about explosives. So these were explosives people and a few others. I was able to get the deputy lab directors. I couldn't get all the lab directors. It's pretty hard to get 3 lab directors in a 20, 30 minutes notice. But I got a team together from 3 labs, and we talked it over, and we decided we really didn't know anything about it, that we couldn't contribute much because we didn't know what to do. So we said, let's talk about it in the morning and get some other people, because it didn't sound like an explosives problem per se. So we got a group of people together the next morning on May 1st, and we talked it over. Tom D'Agostino was on the phone at that time, and we talked it over, and we decided that what we have to do is learn something about this. So let's send 3 people down, 1 from each lab, down to Houston. BP had a great big building, they still do, and in that building was the headquarters for the whole thousands of people working on trying to solve this problem. So we sent 3 people down. We had to hunt them down. They were out jogging and different stuff. We tracked everybody down, got them on the noon plane on Saturday and sent them down to Houston. They then started getting in the midst of everything and learning what was going on. And soon we got some pictures back and all that. And then we had another call the next day, Sunday, and Steve Chu, the secretary, was on that phone call. And so we talked it over, and it turned out, you've heard the adage that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. I knew a little bit about oil fields because I worked as a roustabout and when I was in college. So I knew all the terms and experience. I've been on rigs and all that. So I obviously knew more than anybody on the phone call because none of us really knew anything. We were trying to learn and understand this. So it became clear. So Steve Chu, the secretary, he knew we had the people on the ground. That was good. They were already there. And so he called me up afterwards and said, basically, this is pretty serious. The president asked me to get directly involved. And one of us needs to go to Houston, which is Washington speak for, I had to go to Houston. So I went to Houston. The next day, I believe, one of the strange experiences, I was in the airport texting a guy from Los Alamos, or emailing him, I guess, and I looked across the few chairs over. There was a guy on the thing. It turned out to be the guy I was texting to. He was about 6 feet away. But anyway, we assembled. No one much knew we had about 3 or 4 people each lab. We all got together and went down there. So I'll then relate that's how we got involved. And from that point on, we had a team of 3 laboratories, roughly 15 to 20 people every day till September, down in Houston, working hand in hand with BP. So this is pretty much the story. I'll go through it if I can make it there. Oh, I want to talk about these things generally speaking, and I'll go through them one at a time. This is pretty much the story of what happened, and it's not necessarily the story that's in the book, and it's not the story you read about in the press. There's a lot of press on this. You Google this, you'll get a lot of hits. I can get going here. Oh, these are big drilling ships. They're about the weight of a battleship, and they're much, much bigger. This particular Deepwater Horizon was the name of the ship, not the well. The well's name was Macondo, and the ship is Deepwater Horizon. Deepwater Horizon was owned by Transocean. That became a big issue in the trial, who owned what. And the well, the operator of the well was BP, no longer called British Petroleum, but BP, and a company named Anadarko, 25% of it. But you can see generally what a drilling ship is. They're geoposition stabilized. They kind of go into place, and then they put the GPS position in, and they say stay right here, and it stays right there, and they drill. And it turned out, if you have so this is the well. I'll explain about the geoposition stabilized in a minute. This is what a well looks like. It's hard to condense a well. This well it's 5,000 feet of water, a mile of water, and then about 13,000 feet of well from the mud line down. And that's typical, not the deepest, this was not the deepest by any measure. 18,000 feet was kind of typical for this part of the Gulf. And this well is pretty simple to explain. Imagine a telescope like you used to look through. It's kind of like a telescope that goes the little end down in the ground, except the difference with the telescope is the little piece that starts at the very bottom goes all the way to the top. So you have a long tube all the way from the bottom of the top that's in the middle, and then you have these concentric pipes around it going up. So this well, so that means there are a lot of different flows for annuli and all different things, but there's a well, there's a pipe all the way to the very bottom, and of course the reservoir, or the intercept, was at the very bottom. This, by the way, was not going to be a production well. This was going to be an inventoried well. We estimated it might have 100 million barrels in it. You figure that out at $100 a barrel. It's about $10 billion. It's not worth developing really right away until they get other assets in the region. So it was an inventory well, a pretty good one. Had a little bad reputation, but nevertheless. So the accident itself was simply a result of bad judgment. There were a lot of issues that came up in the well. They had wells are you probably don't. A well is controlled by the mud that's in the well. So the well has pressure at the bottom. Imagine a garden hose feeding in there from the faucet, and you hold it straight up in the air. If you put enough heavy stuff in that, heavy fluid in there, you put enough in there, it'll stop the flow. And that's how oil wells are contained. They're always contained by mud. That's why you have mud engineers and mud companies, Halliburton and all you want a certain kind of mud, they build it for you, and then you pump it in. But the wells are controlled because they've got heavy mud in them. This well had heavy mud in it, and it was reasonably under control. They were doing testing on cement that they hoped would harden and seal it permanently so they could walk away. They wanted to get the ship off. But they didn't pay attention to some of the test results, and they also didn't quite understand the integrity of some of the cement that they put in. And they made some bad decisions. This is a story of bad decisions followed by good decisions, which is like life. So this is the well. It was, I think it was about 3 feet in diameter at the top, and it was about 7 to 9 inches in diameter at the bottom. It was about 40 miles off the tip of Louisiana, the tip that comes out from New Orleans. Pretty easy to get to. and the helicopters and ship went back and forth all the time. And the oil slick had gotten to be quite big. It ultimately reached the shore, but when this particular image, view was taken, it was 5 or 6 miles, maybe 10 miles across. So no one knew what to do. No one knew how much oil was going into the Gulf, and no one knew how to stop the well, and no one knew how to clean it up in the water. Now, our job was to stop the well. The ship, caught on fire. What happened was the well lost control, and from the very bottom of the well, oil and gas, but mostly gas was the issue, came up through the riser pipe, came up on the ship, and the generators overran, had a spark here or there, and the whole rig caught on fire. 11 people died. People, dumped the lifeboats off. Some people jumped off the deck. It was a terrible situation. So they pumped fire on it for about 2-3 days, and finally it sank. And then all was left was the oil slick, getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. Somebody mentioned that maybe they put too much water on it, sank it. That's probably true. But nevertheless, the rig sank. So the image you start with when we arrived on the scene, here's a big ship a mile above the bottom of the mud line. That's the bottom of the ocean. And there's a riser pipe about 18 inches in diameter between the top of the well and the ship. So there's a mile of pipe. And then there's, of course, 2 miles underneath, more than 2 miles underneath the ocean, underneath the bottom of the ocean. Well, the ship sank, like so. And the riser pipe, the mile, made a big arch, much bigger than the St. Louis Arch, but made a big arch, like that, and just bent over. And it stayed there for a little while. And then all of a sudden, it tipped over to the side and fell down. And I'll show you some pictures of the kink. So you can imagine what happened to that riser pipe. It just ultimately just bent down. And that's where we started. So this was the biggest activity going on probably on the planet in summer 2010. We watched ourselves on CNN every day and looked to see what we were doing. Be sure that the news got it about right. There were about 40 to 50,000 people working one place or another. There weren't 7,000 vessels right on the wellhead, but there were a lot. There were easily 100 in the region right of the well. The others were cleaning up and doing all kinds of stuff all over. This is a BP slide. They counted everything. We had a lot of drilling rigs. We had 6 or 7 other drilling rigs. And you can only go in here if your geoposition stabilized. In other words, you got a coordinate system from the Coast Guard, and you went there and you stayed there. You weren't allowed to sail around in there. And I remember one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, the White House had sent down a NOAA ship. And the NOAA ship we ultimately used to try to detect leakage in the well. And the NOAA ship didn't get the word that you can't sail into this fleet. And I remember having to shut the whole thing down and getting the Coast Guard. We had Coast Guard people on the site, Admiral level, and shut down that ship right away because they should not have been sailing in there at all. It was very busy. The ocean was full of what's called VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, which come out of oil things, and it was dangerous and hot. One of the big issue almost every day was, can the crew survive through the day, the ones that are out on the ship? So very busy. We were in Houston. If you looked at the seafloor, there was a lot of stuff going on. There were a couple of relief wells being drilled. This is a lake picture. There were ships that ultimately were collecting oil on the top. I'll show you the blowout preventers in a second. But there were pipes and connecting points and pipelines going up to ships all over. And this was all done in a matter of days. I'll describe the kill shot here in a minute. But if you can imagine, anybody who's worked in a big enterprise know it's hard to get things done and it's hard to get through red tape. Well, there was no red tape. I was there as an outsider. I knew pretty much everybody in BP, but I went down to a contractor company that was supplying hardware for whatever, and I said, I need a pressure gauge. I want to measure pressure with a probe to measure pressure inside the bent pipe. And he looked at me and he said, well, here's my laptop. And we looked through there and we found a pressure gauge and a probe. I said, that might work. He says, I'll get it to you, but I can't have it out on the rig for 45 minutes. And he didn't ask me for a piece of paper. He didn't ask my name. He just got it shipped to the ship. And that's exactly. Now, there were lawyers on every floor. I'll tell you about the trial later. This was arguably the biggest civil litigation in U.S. history, certainly around this topic. There may have been others. Financially, this was a big, no one really, I've not seen the accounting. I'll tell you about the trial later, but basically, BP's stock loss was $100 billion in that period from April to June, which means the retirees in Britain, mostly, lost a ton of money. So everybody was upset. There was a lot of intrigue, though, that BP stock would go so low that somebody else would come in and buy them. That was a big worry if you're BP, because you can't control necessarily the price of your stock in a crisis. And other people have cash and they can buy you and you're no longer a company. That was on the minds of a lot of BP folks.
But then they inherit the mess, right?
Yeah, but they knew the mess could be dealt with as BP dealt with it. That's exactly right. They get the mess, and that's a risk. On the other hand, another thing to think about, BP is a big company. I don't remember what their profits were, but about 10, 15 billion, either a quarter or a year, I can't remember. So this cost them about 60 billion plus when all the accounting was done. But on the other hand, had it been a small company, and there are small companies that maybe had a market value of, say, $5 billion instead of hundreds, they could just walk away. And then there's nobody. Then who do you get to do it? Because we, the government team, couldn't do it. We had to have BP. So who would do it? Still a concern. And there are a lot of small operators in there, hopefully not with comparables. So this is a series of shots looking right above the bottom of the ocean. This is the very top. This is a joint. This is ultimately, it's kind of swivels, let the ship move around a little bit. This is a swivel joint on top. Then you got the control pods that there are computers down there. These are all done with ROVs. All the ships have ROVs, and the remotely operated vehicles, they go around where you tell them, and they got little fans, propellers that move themselves around. They can't grab and pull much, but if they grab onto something else, they can pull. So every ship had a couple of them. We had about 10 operating at all times. So this is going down from the top. This is one of the control pods. There was a lot of problems with control pods. We're supposed to activate automatic stuff. Oh, that, by the way, is worth saying. So why couldn't they just shut it off and stop the flow of oil and gas? It's supposed to shut off automatically. By the way, these rigs shut off all the time and go away. If a hurricane comes, they shut everything off, make sure the mud's right and well, and they go off. And this happened during the summer of 2010. Then they come back and latch back on. They unlatch just about where this is, just at this place right here. So why didn't that happen? Well, it didn't happen because the control panels weren't right and the blowout preventers didn't quite shut. And the big thing is they took the mud out of the well. There was, I don't know, maybe $500,000 worth of mud in the well. Had they just left it in there, I wouldn't be telling this story. They decided to pull it out and displace it with seawater, which is not as heavy. So the seawater wouldn't hold the well. They were pumping the mud out. That's when this all happened, because they took the mud out. So why did they take the mud out? I've talked to some real experts about it. One is it had some value, but secondly, the cement would have cured better in a seawater environment, and so they argued that. But somebody made the decision to pull the mud out.
They displaced it out.
What?
They displaced it out.
They displaced it out. Yeah, they displaced it with seawater. Yeah, mud comes out, seawater goes in, the density changes by about a factor of 2, and the net effect is it didn't hold the well. Okay, moving on down, this is more of the pod. Behind here is a couple of blowout preventers called annular core. This part that goes with what's called the lower marine LMRP, lower marine riser package. By the way, in the oil business, everything is downstream from the reservoir. It goes from the reservoir to the gas station pump. That's the language in the oil business. And everything's downstream. So when you go up the pipe, you're going down. It's lower, the next step up is lower, then lower, lower. Yeah, everything's backwards. And by the way, they don't use pressure to measure the pressure. You go down to 10,000 feet below the deck and ask what the pressure is, and they'll say it's 12.6. And what they mean by that is from the rig floor to that point, that's the density of mud it takes to hold it stable at that point. So no one has to think, what mud do I need? They just have to know, because the pressure, every pressure measurement is labeled in mud density. Okay, this is starting where the the upper, but we're going lower. Blowout preventers are, that's the famous one. One of the top is the famous one that didn't work. That's called a blind shear ram. And it's the one that didn't, supposed to cut the pipe and seal, and it didn't. The one below it's a shear ram, which has nothing but shear and doesn't seal. Then there's a couple pipe rams, and finally a test ram. And then this is the joint at the mud line, very bottom. So a few feet below here. This is probably 4 feet in diameter, 5 feet in diameter, something like that. So the pipe's about 3 feet. So you can see we're down there. Okay, so here's the kink. This is a picture we were confronted with. It is a kink. Remember this riser and fell down? Well, there's a kink in here, a bunch of little lines, and then the one in the middle is the 18-inch riser. It doesn't hold a lot of pressure, so it's leaking. Well, after a while, there's sand in this oil, and as it went through that kink, it finally wore a hole. First, there was no hole there. And this is where I was trying to get the probe to put in here, see what the pressure was. But this kink started leaking, and we were watching that. Another view, one hole, then two holes, and a bigger hole as the sand washed through. This is another shot, not much more interesting. So, what do you do? There's a couple of slides that I should put in the other over here, but normally in the oil well, when you bring in Red Adair's company or something like that, in the oil field, what you try to do is get over to the well and hook up to it and pump mud in like crazy, with the thought that you can get a little mud started in, then a little more, a little more, a little more, a little more, and finally you got enough mud in the well where there's no flow, no pressure. That was called a kill shot. And we tried the kill shot in May, I forgot the dates probably on here, May 26, 27, 28. Kill shot was a big deal. This was, stand back guys. We are the oil field experts. We do this all the time. Kind of the good old boys from wherever, not BP, but other people who do these kill shots. And they did some fantastic things. They built a mud, they put in 30,000, a barrel is 42 gallons. You'd like to think it's 55. That's what they shipped it, but it's 42 gallons. And so pumped in about 30,000 barrels of oil in these kill shots. But they rigged up a mud pump and a barge to hold the mud, because it's a lot of mud. And they rigged it all up in a matter of about a week or so. It normally takes about 9 to 10 months, but that was very typical. I'll tell you more about the pace a little bit later. So the net effect was everything got hooked up, start pumping. So they pumped like crazy to get mud into the well, and it went up to 80 barrels a minute. Fantastic rate of mud going in. And I remember being in the control room, we were watching it, and the CEO of BP was there, and we were all saying, well, I think we got this. It started down, then it didn't go any lower. And so we didn't have very good instrumentation, by the way. But the net judgment was it wasn't going to work. I still don't know, since the instrumentation is so bad, exactly where we were at that point, but we all decided to give up. So we gave up on the kill shot. And when it talks about bridging materials, everything you can think of was put in there to you put the mud, try to go down, but going up, you try to put stuff that'll clog up the holes. And there were golf balls and piece of tires. I remember Steve Chu was looking over there. There's a Titleist coming out way out the riser over there. It just blew that back out. It didn't stop it up. There are places to inject, by the way, so you can get it in there. Bridging materials didn't work. Kill shot didn't work. Made the big news. Nobody knew what they were doing. Everything was, horrible, because we didn't have a solution. And this typical oil well, stand back, let us do this, didn't work at all. So the other thing that was tried was some big cofferdams. These were big collecting devices that were put out at the end of the riser, because that's where most of the oil was initially. And they didn't work because in the deep water, natural gas mixes with water and produces what we call, it's called hydrate, but it's like snow. And the snow clogs up everything. Things hardly work. Well known, and it clogged them up and they didn't work at all. So that was about the same time this didn't work. So what to do? Everybody was concerned. I remember the discussions so greatly that I typically got a call from BP. We talked it over, and then we talked with the U.S. team, the government team, and we finally decided that the thing to do was start collecting the oil. So that's called the containment period. And so we put a bunch of ships out there and started collecting oil by name. We put little caps on top. We sawed off the riser, and where it was hooked on top of the oil, you sawed that off, and put kind of a collecting device on top called a top hat. It reminds me of the pressure cookers of old days when you had the things together. The pressure cooker would while around and keep the steam pressure up. So we made about 12 of those, and this says number 4, but we had a number that we made, and they sort of worked. They started collecting. We were collecting. It turned out about half the oil, which went into ships and went into tankers and got hauled off. But that was not a clear solution. So about the end of June, about the middle of June, I got a call from BP, and we discussed doing something more permanent. And that was to put on a permanent cap, if that was possible. And then I'll tell you what happened after that, but it turned out to be, I thought, a pretty good idea. So we agreed to present that to both BP management and to the government. So we did, and that became known as the capping stack. And so we had to brief first about 4 or 5 cabinet members, Interior and Homeland Security and Energy and EPA, and I forgot all the other. We briefed, and so the next day we had to brief the president. So this is a presidential briefing slide here that I drew, trying to explain what would happen that we were going to do. I think we needed the president's okay to go ahead, but it was never clear exactly who decided what. The decision maker that went to BP was Thad Allen. He had to, whatever we decided, only he could convey that to BP. And that was his job. I'll tell you about the schedule generally speaking. So this is a presidential briefing slide. And it kind of goes like this. We were collecting oil with these top hats, and that was going up. We're also collecting through some subsidiary lines that were going off. And we were actually collecting at about 25,000 barrels a day, I think, at the peak. So we were collecting a lot of oil, but there's still a lot of oil. If you remember on CNN, it showed the pictures of oil coming out around everything. We weren't collecting that. That was going right into the Gulf. So the idea was to put on a sealing cap, which would seal that flow, no flow. And then we had to use euphemistic words. We had integrity. We wanted to do an integrity test, which means we would diagnose the well from there. Get the cap on. We got some control. We could shut the well in, and I'll tell you why that's not necessarily a good idea. So we would test the well, and we would decide what's going on. But the real issue was, and this was humongous, is there a leak down further below the mud line? Imagine you've got a garden hose, and if the garden hose has no holes in it, you put your finger on it, you get quite a bit of pressure. Imagine there's a bunch of holes back about 50 feet. You don't get much pressure. But the water's coming out the holes. Well, the issue here was the water's coming out the well somewhere further down. What are you going to do? We didn't know. No one knew. But we did work out. I actually gave them I'll talk about the criteria in a minute. But the bottom line was, if you shut it in, closed it off, and the pressure, we had good pressure valves now on all this new capping stack. Had 3 blow-up preventers and a lot of pressure gauges and everything. Of course, we had 3, 2 worked. That's pretty good for the bottom of the Gulf. So if the pressure came up high, that means the well was in pretty good shape. If the pressure came in low from where it was, that means the well might have damage. Then we got a real problem. You can't stop it. So the next slide is one that we made up, that we gave to BP. And it said, if the pressure only goes to 5,000 PSI, by the way, the pressure at the reservoir was 12,000 PSI, roughly. And so if the pressure only went up to 5,000, not good. Means the well was in bad shape. If it went to 8,000 or so, it was good, and you could leave the thing shut, the well shut, for 48 hours. Here you had to shut it off in 6 hours. I made up this number, but it had a reason to be made up, 20,000 barrels. And the lab team worked this out. But basically, this allows you to flow 20,000 barrels in that period of time. So 8,000, say 8,500 is good, 5,000 is bad. Where do you think it came? Right in the middle. It came right about in here. 6,600, 6,800 went to 69, came right in here. So that's like science, right? That's what you understand the least. Wasn't good, wasn't bad. What do? So this is the night of July the 15th, I think it was, and we were on the phone all night trying to figure out what to do. Many in the government, I led the government science team, so we argued, maybe it's good to open it back up. BP was sitting there saying, oh my gosh, we're going to open this thing back up. Last thing we wanted was open this well up because we stopped the flow for a little while. Well, turned out that Coast Guard Admiral, his idea was, well, we said we'd give him 24 hours. Maybe we should give him 24 hours. Novel idea, so we gave him 24 hours. And then I'll describe what happened in the 24 hours. Now, the process went like this, basically. There would be an issue of some kind and some action you were going to do. BP would look at it and see what they want to do. We would look at it and see what we want to do, the lab team, what would we want to do. Then we'd get together and we'd hash it out, what made sense, what would work, what would not, all over the phone with slides. Back and forth, back and forth. This might take much of a day. Along towards the evening, we'd reach a resolution, and then we'd have to type up a paragraph, and it had to go through the White House, and the White House had to clear everything, and then the net effect of that had to come back down, if everything was good, and approved by Thad Allen would relay to BP, and it would be a go or a no-go or whatever was the answer. We did that over and over and over again. Sometimes the operations would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. We'd do them overnight. They'd write procedures. Everything was done under procedures, all controlled overnight. I mean, we write thousands of pages of procedures in just a few days, all approved, all reviewed, because there was a big command structure set up within BP that had everything organized and going. If you've worked in the U.S. government, to think about getting 10 pages of procedures through might take 6-8 months. We might have 6-8 hours at the most. But anyway, this was the key issue once the solution started in place. So this is a sealing cap. I don't think that note is right. Anyway, this is the sealing cap. It had 3 blowout preventers. It was about, see this guy, it was about this big and weighed, I don't remember, 40 tons or something like that. One of the big issues, we put this on top of everything, is it all going to tip over? That's something the labs worked at quite a bit. Okay, so that happened. So we gave him 24 hours. What's going to happen now after 24 hours? The question was, is the well leaking? So we put in every protocol you can imagine to decide if there was any oil or gas coming out anywhere around this well, including the ground at the well. BP had bubble counters. They actually watched video and they counted bubbles and recorded them. This is a ship that NOAA had. This ship was actually used to detect the breathing of fish a mile deep. So fish are down there breathing. You can detect them from a mile in water. So we were looking, this is bubbles that were actually coming up. There were reasons for bubbles. We just hope it wasn't because the well was leaking. So these are some bubbles that were coming for whatever reason. This ship, I can't remember what the name of the ship was. But these bubbles kind of came up. This is actually video. So we watched it this is the most researched site. We had 3 geophysical runs a day over this with ships, recorded the results overnight, analyzed them, came back in the morning, had a team meeting to decide Can we go another day? We went a day by day by day. Every day was enormous amount of data, enormous amount of analysis, enormous amount of meeting, get together, make a decision. But everything had to be done in 24 hours. This is then the keeper. The lab teams, the 3 labs, were there, and they had all the data, so they decided to analyze the flow. The flow was a big question. A lot of people thought how much oil came out was a big deal, oil and gas. But also some people thought it affected how the well was going to be, could be contained and all that. That all got mishmashed up in the scientific literature. But this was the result of the 3 lab calculation. Roughly 4.9 million barrels, of which 0.8 were collected, and that makes 4.1. Remember that number, 4.1 million barrels. A barrel's 42 gallons. The reason this is important is the fine from the Clean Water Act that goes with 1 barrel is $4,200. If you multiply that number there, 4.1 by 4,200, you get $17.2 billion. That was the fine. That would have been the fine. I'll tell you about the trial in a minute. Okay, so we worked this out. I actually did the first calculation of day 87 myself. It occurred to me that it's all a lot of complicated stuff about the orifices and all that stuff, but the net effect is if you write down 2 conditions, when you have one, you flow and not flow, and you have flow going to the ship that you measured, write it all down, work out the equations, everything about the well goes away, and you're left with just the pressures and the flow. And I did that calculation that evening, and it came out 53.5, and I think we finally decided this was like 52 or something over here. So bottom line is we knew this day here, the flow, and by methods we determined this flow across here. This is day 1, this is day 87. Each day this is the flow in 50,000 barrels a day would be right here. That's about what it was at that time. Okay, keep that in mind when we'll talk about the trial. Okay, next step was you got a cap on it. What are you going to do? It's not flowing. Pump some mud in it. That was the plan all along. So we pumped in mud. And again, this was going to make everybody's worried. When you pump in mud, there's so much pressure it's going to bust everything. Well, everybody was worried. We had bets on how much it was going to go up in pressure. I think I picked like 400, and some of the BP executives picked 500, 700. We even had wagers, $5 each or something. No one ever paid. The answer was it went up 17 pounds. And those that didn't pressurize it. So we got the mud in. Then the well is pretty much stable. Mud's there. So the next step is to pump in cement. That was also a big deal. Are we going to let them pump in? Pumping in the mud took a lot of agony to figure out whether they could proceed. Figured it out and did it. And then the next was pumping cement. Well, the question is the cement going to get in there and get out in the formation and all that? So we finally decided it was, and we weren't going to break anything. So we got about 500 barrels of cement in. And this was August the 6th. August the 6th. My birthday is August the 5th, so I knew, easy to keep in mind. The well was dead on August the 6th. Subsequently, we pulled the well preventer off, everything was off, and the well just sits there. Of course, it's cemented in with good cement. But if you recall back when it first was presented to the president, they said, well, what do you typically do in the oil field? Well, you drill a relief well. It means you drill another well, say 3/4 of a mile away, and you drill in and you try to intercept that well, and then you can mud it in from the bottom, and so far so good. The president said, well, if one's good, two's better, drill 2. So they start drilling 2. This is not a small expense, but 2 relief wells. They were about 3/4 of a mile away. One was well ahead of the other. And we let it go because there didn't seem any harm in it. BP was willing to spend the money. So they drilled down. Imagine this. They drilled down 2.5 miles deep and 3/4 of a mile out. They drilled down, and the whole goal was to hit a 7-inch hole at the bottom. And they hit it right on. And in fact, the plan was to hit the hole. It was a 9-inch hole with a 7-inch casing. The plan was to hit the hole, stop, figure out where you were, and then mill into the casing. And they can do all that from basically 3 miles away. So if you own a lease next to somebody, don't think they can't drill into your oil, because they can go anywhere they want to go. And there's a lot of technology went into this, and it was a fantastic display of their capability. It did nothing. Now, the announcement that the well was done after this intercept, because the president, recall, had said drill a relief well. Relief well, I think it was September 21st. At that point, it was okay to declare the well dead. But the well was dead on August the 6th. So the relief wells were a nice show of technology, but didn't contribute to killing the well. Everybody was involved. The U.S. government had about 5 or 6 agencies. There was some people from NASA. DOD had their deep submarine rescue people there on station. We had a whole bunch of people. Our job was to really lead that set of folks. Coast Guard was heavily involved. USGS, Marcia McNutt, the director of USGS, was there virtually every day, had our office there. As you imagine, states, we had to brief the governors, and there were, there were a lot of industry folks around, but you know, you never know exactly what you're going to get from a competitor, right? The working level people, it was very clear, they really contributed. Some were very cautious. They were concerned about this, that, or the other, the well leaking, liquefaction at the surface, all kind of stuff they're worried about. And we're very conservative about doing things. The executive sometimes says, oh, just go ahead and do this, do that. But they didn't have any responsibility, right? So they could talk all they wanted. BP was very cautious and very deliberate about every decision. So a lot of folks, a lot of industry suppliers. The company I was telling you about is Oceaneering, a small little company. It basically worked like this. It was all about making decisions. How do you make a decision? Every few days, a key decision had to be made. BP would work out how it would work. We would have to analyze it, understand it, have our own recommendations, go back to the labs and figure out if it made sense. And then out of that would come a decision. Net effect would be, it would go to a unified command, which was Thad Allen, who was, strangely enough, the commandant of the Coast Guard, but he retired about the same time I did, so we sometimes he was in uniform, sometimes he was in a suit. But Thad was with it till the end, as was I. I retired, it was 140 days. I retired at day 70. And one thing I did while I was at the lab was be sure there was indemnification for the labs against any work. And that gets signed off. President can do that. That got signed off for all 3 labs. I wouldn't let anybody work until that had been signed off. And then when I retired, I had no affiliation with the lab, of course. I was just an unpaid volunteer, and I got it for myself. I didn't want to be tied up and get sued for something. So the net effect was it worked out all right. So this is a typical day. I don't know if you can see that Steve Chu. This is yours truly, and you can see everybody's arguing with me. That was a typical day. I don't know what I was talking about, and maybe didn't know what I was talking about. But there was this was a war room we had down there at BP all the day. Yeah, everything was done on live video screens. Another little interesting story, I think it's in the book. BP wanted everybody to communicate with everybody. DOE wanted, and so did the government. They had all kind. We set up websites and all kind of stuff. But the way BP decided to communicate was to just call AT&T and set up a conference call, and any phone could get on that conference call. There would be thousands of people sometimes on that conference call. And it's funny, if you ever worked in the Gulf Coast, people say a few things which you wouldn't want said in public, and that will sometimes get out there. But I remember when a guy jokingly said, he was an ROV operator, he said, "I just go over and clip this pipe over here." And he was just joking around, but he was joking around on this conference call. So the day we were going to shut in the well with the capping stack, it had a choke, it had a control valve. You turn it like this, and the ROV would turn it, and the guy in Houston would say, "Okay, give it 1 turn." I think it took 15 turns. So give it another turn. But before he started to give commands to close it, the AT&T operator comes on, and everybody's on this conference call at that point. The AT&T operator comes on and says, "Gentlemen, I just discovered that this phone line has been open since April the 21st. I'm going to terminate this conference call." And everybody, please, please do not terminate the conference. That was the entire communication system, was one conference call. She didn't do it. Yeah, she didn't do it. So, anyway, this is a typical day down in Houston. This is a subsequent meeting where Steve and I and Ken Salazar, that's Thad Allen, this is Ken Salazar, David Hayes. They're Department of Interior and the deputy, and Steve's Energy. And that's Thad. We were on a panel, a follow-up panel to deal with something. We were trying to, it was a conference to decide what to do in the future. So what's left at the top of the well, once we took everything off, we went to Michoud, that missile site, big missile fabrication facility in New Orleans, where they built the shuttle tanks. Everything was shipped there on a barge. And anyway, what's at this well now at 5,000 feet is a memorial to the 11 people that were killed. That's all that's left of Macondo well. Let me close by talking about the trial. This is an interesting trial. I was going to avoid the trial, and I was actually on record saying I wouldn't participate in the trial, but finally the Justice Department convinced me that they needed help to figure out their side of this case. So they contacted me, and there were two issues that I was involved with. One was, did BP do a good job? And I spent weeks with it. Well, there was a question of competence.
Before or after?
Oh, afterwards.
Okay.
Afterwards, yeah. No, they didn't do a good job before. That was clear. Yeah, that was another part of the trial.
Okay.
That was basically where they at fault, and they basically admitted at fault. Yeah, they were negligent, and in fact, it was ruled to be gross negligence for the accident. But the issue I had was after that.
Phase.
Yeah, did they work? Did they know what they were doing, and did they work? Yeah, and so I spent weeks with the Justice Department. We went over everything, why this decision, up that, all that stuff. And finally, the Justice Department said, you know what? There's no fine associated with this. We're not going to pursue this. So after all that work, that issue went away. It didn't go away for BP, but I'll tell you kind of how that worked. But it went away for the government didn't push that issue anymore. But the other issue was called quantification. That means how much oil came out. Because remember, the Clean Water Act fine is based on that. So I was the lead-off witness for that. I spent, gosh knows how many weeks involved with this, that, and the other, and depositions, hours and hours of deposition. And then I was on the stand in New Orleans down the Hale Boggs courthouse down there in the middle of New Orleans. Anyway, basically saying that, we did what we did. We had the facts we had. We came up with this 4.1 million barrel number. BP, of course, had come up with a smaller number. And as you imagine, and BP had a world-class flow calculation. They brought in a whole team from England. They were from England, and they were really good people, very qualified, knew what they were doing, and it was to their advantage to think of things that would slow down the oil in the beginning. No one argued with the 87-day, that 52,000 or whatever. That was even my simple calculation was irrefutable in most everybody's mind. No one could argue, but they did argue with the beginning. They thought it went up and not down. So the trial went on, and it was you couldn't talk to people that you knew. There were two Sandia scientists who decided to become expert witness, and they had done a bunch of calculations in support of the Department of Justice. And the net effect of the trial was the judge said, here's a government team over here that did 4.1, and they seem to know what they're talking about. And then here's BP over here that says it's 2.2 or 2.3. They seem to know what they're talking about. So what would a judge do when faced with two numbers? Exactly. So the official record now, no scientists have ever corrected their data, because the official flow number is like 3.3 or something like that, right in the middle. Most of the scientists are off. They say 4.9. That was always wrong. They just don't read very carefully, because we were clear. So that's kind of how the trial went. The judge ruled. But there were a bunch of issues on the table besides the flow rate. There was also something called NRDA, National Resources Defense Act, which is penalties for messing up the environment beyond clean water. and then something else and something else. And so the judge, they negotiated a deal to lump it all together, everything, get it all over with. And they awarded, BP paid $20 billion. Actually, not such a bad deal, considered Clean Water Act alone could have been 15. But they awarded $20 billion, and BP paid it out, I think, over time even, so it was less than it was. So that settled the trial. It was an enormously big trial. You couldn't talk to anybody, you couldn't deal with anybody. It was interesting that the BP attorneys who were interrogating me, both in deposition and on the trial, I kind of liked them. I was all prepared to do battle, and they were pretty nice folks. But on that issue, did they know what they were doing? In my deposition, I had argued about, yeah, they seem to know what they're doing, and I cited examples. I actually gave an example of other complex things like running a nuclear test and stuff like that. BP, for some of this magnitude, seemed to do a very good job. Only the military, in my judgment, could have done anything of this scale as organized. It's 40,000 people, right? So of this scale, so technologically advanced. And so BP captured all that, and in their argument in the case, they used my video to support their case. Why they knew what they're doing, which was fair, because they really didn't know what they're doing. So the trial ended, and everybody went away, I guess, reasonably satisfied. There's tons of money. There were criminal cases as well. This was a civil case. The criminal cases were against individuals and against BP. To make a long story short, in one of the criminal cases, there was this concept that we should get some money to do some research. My original idea was to have the government, because basically the government doesn't know much about this business. It was all pickup sticks and learning things at the labs. But we got into it deeply and we figured it out. But we weren't resident. The government had no resident expertise. So in one of the criminal trials, they did award $500 million for research. And I thought they were going to give it to the Department of Interior. But it turns out you don't do that, because the Congress does not like any money going to anybody that they don't control. So you just can't give, you out and write a check for $500 million to the Department of Interior or Department of Energy, they can't take it. Because the Congress is going to say, well, we can't control that, so we don't want you can't give it to them. And that's exactly what happened. They couldn't give it to the Department of Interior to do this, that, or the other, and they gave it to the National Academy of Sciences. And that's why, my association with it, generally speaking, was why I chaired the board for the National Academy to figure out how to invest that $500 million. So that's pretty much the story. You should be proud of the labs. There were many nights at 2 or 3 in the morning when I would call somebody in Los Alamos and say, we've got a 7 o'clock meeting and we've got to have the following analysis done. And never did they say, I don't think we can get that done. They always said, we'll do the best we can and see you at 7 o'clock. And invariably, they got it done. Same at Livermore, same at Sandia. They happen routinely. Everybody worked together. The myth is the labs are always arguing and fighting, and that's kind of a show. When something has to be done, the labs get together, and they work together very well. And it was a great pleasure for me to lead that team, because instant support, instant everything, didn't matter what you had to do. The lab supported it and got done what needed to be done, and a lot of stuff had to get done. So you should be proud of the labs. They're your labs, by the way. You should be proud. So this story took 140 days out of my life, 70 of which I was paid to be the director of Sandia, 70 of which I was just a civilian, unpaid volunteer. And then followed on that were about 6 years worth of other stuff that derived from it. But my original plan was I bought a new tractor. And I had it on my place down in Florida, and I bought it in March. And I said, deliver this thing in July when I'm going to retire. And of course, I really delivered it in late September. Still have it. But the whole idea was to do something else in retirement. It turned out getting involved in the oil business was something I didn't plan on. it had an impact. I enjoyed a lot of it. It may seem stressful. It seemed at the time sort of stressful. I had to meet with the president and brief the president and talk to him and all that stuff. Somehow it didn't seem, when you're helping, it seems to not be quite so bad. But it was a great experience. I'm glad I could share it with you. So thank you. Any other questions anybody has? Yeah, I'll start over here and we'll go around if that's all right.
Yeah, I worked with BP on the North Slope of Alaska, and when I saw what happened in the Gulf, it reminded me of when BP first came to the United States. And to me, I mean, like they had one man to a room, like they had in the North Sea. They had a lot of higher quality, and the way they treated the hands, the way they did everything was much different than Exxon and the other oil companies. And they were being pushed to, we can do it, in my opinion, we can do it cheaper and easier, we can cut this corner, we can do this. And I think that BP's culture changed by the time this blowout happened, where maybe they wouldn't have been as careful and spend as much money as they normally would do because they wanted to get in step with how American oil companies operate.
Yeah, there's a lot to what you say. Many people have talked about BP's culture because they had that accident in Texas City or wherever it was and other things. It was interesting to watch. Now, I can't cast judgment because I wasn't involved with them prior to this. But they had all the normal stuff that we worked in their office space. They had all the normal signs and slogans, don't trip over your, this, that, or the other, and watch out for accident, all that stuff. And safety message was there. Every day when we started these phone calls, the Secretary of Interior and myself and Thad Allen, there was a safety briefing first, every phone call. So there was a bit, they were going through some cultural shift at the time. It's just hard to say. A lot of people have studied it. No one seems to know. BP had a different way of doing things, and they did have a reputation for trying to be efficient. And sometimes, and pulling off this well and displacing the mud out with the data they had was a very bad decision. Almost cost them the company.
Saving a few pennies.
Well, saving some money and maybe getting a better cement job. Whatever was the reason, they viewed it as the right thing to do. The BP VPs out on this rig earlier were out there giving a safety award for rig operations just a few days before. So, and to me, the message on safety is this. There's a theory that the little things lead to the big things. That's a theory. That is not necessarily a fact. In other words, you can have the best, cleanest workflow, which is a good idea no matter what. You can eliminate all slip, trips, and falls in business and medical, and you can still have a big accident. And that's a study which has never been really completed. But the BP culture, you're exactly right, it is being examined quite a lot. I personally was very impressed with BP's culture and their get-it-done attitude and their ability to get things done. If you've never been to Houston, it's the world center of oil. You can pick up the telephone in Houston. You can have anything built and shipped to you based on a phone call, and you can get it in an unbelievable time. That's where everybody's in Houston. Got another question over here, too. Oh, yes, sir.
Yes, I've read a lot about that, and I was just curious how the production rate that I read about a little bit higher than what you were talking about. One time they were talking about perhaps between 75,000 and 100,000
That's correct.
barrels a day.
That's correct.
That's shut in now,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yes.
People forgot about that. Is there nobody else that's going to come back someday because we know about the accident? We now know, pardon me, we now know how to take care of it if something happened like that again. It's awful tough to walk away from a 50 to 75,000 barrel a day well. And if it isn't somebody local, there's other oil companies in this world we don't own the Gulf.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you know anything about? Have you
Well,
heard anything?
Well, I know that it's monitored now because everybody's still concerned about any leakage or whatnot. The well, if you think about it, it has a good hydraulic connector port on it and this little cap. Cement can be drilled back out. The well is not an undoable do. It's certainly a well-studied well. But whether it's worth it is, BP's PR would be terrible if they went back to the Macondo well.
I guess I wasn't talking about going back into the same well, okay? You gotta move over.
Oh, well, people will do that.
And you got the same formation.
Yeah, that will happen.
Yeah.
But
But you haven't heard anything.
No, but you could easily study the leasing patterns and see who has what lease. There are other leases around the Macondo, and BP's lease probably will expire. It is very reasonable that people drill in the same region. There are 175 rigs in the Gulf today, something like that, and 3,000 platforms. So yeah, it's very reasonable someone would go
Still
nearby.
drilling in that deep water.
Oh, and deeper. Oh yeah, no, this is not deep water. It's called deep water, 5,000 feet. No, the next steps are to go, BP has a program now to go to 25,000 PSI, which is 15,000 feet of water or something like that. Yeah, no, deep water drilling is moving forward. Yeah, absolutely. And in this region.